My topic is Black conservatives. Black conservatives. And for some, this topic is sensitive. Some people um, embrace conservatism proudly, and they think it's a good thing. And what I want to do is I want to just engage in some sharing some information to try to put conservatism, and particularly Black conservatism, within context so that we can get a clear understanding of it. I've spoken about Black conservatism before, but I want to add some dimensions to it. I think that are very critical dimensions. So as I go into this, um, try to, if you are conservative, don't take this offensively. Take this as critical analysis, and take a look at it and just evaluate it, and put it all in context. Let me start out by saying that when we look at the ideal of conservatism, what is a conservative? Um, Generally, conservatives say that they believe in traditional values and fiscal responsibility. Conservatives are typically pro-life, anti-abortion, and they promote traditional family values. And so that's in a nutshell the cornerstone of of conservatism. But when we look at traditional values in terms of conservatism in America, there was slavery, there was Jim Crow segregation, and there's also anti-Black discrimination. And these are part of the traditional values of America. When we go back and look at the history, these are values that have been in place since the beginning of the country. It is part of the tradition and legacy of white supremacy in America. So when you think in terms of traditional values, you have to actually look at and analyze what are the traditional values of America. It was that America was organized as the white man's country, the white man's country, and in addition to that, it had a place for Black people in America. As part of a system of exploitation, Black people were subjected to slavery. They were subjected to Jim Crow segregation, and there's been a continuing legacy of institutional racism. There's been a legacy of police racial profiling. There has been a legacy of redlining. There has been a legacy of predatory lending. There's been a legacy of the exploitation of Black people in America. And this is part of the traditional values of American society. So when someone says they're conservative and you don't really subject it to scrutiny, then you may miss the fact that anyone who comes and says in America that they believe in traditional values, then they are telling you openly that, hey, I'm anti-Black. I think Black people should be in their place. And they have a viewpoint that's consistent with the history of America. When we look at this ideal about traditional family values, I want you to think in terms of, just for a minute, think about traditional family values. Where someone says they support traditional family values, but their policies, their beliefs all structure around a system that actually is destructive to the poor and to the families of poor people. Their policies actually are derogatory for poor people. They tend to tear poor people's families apart, both poor white people as well as poor Black people. They just generally, conservative values are destructive to the traditional family. In addition to that, when we look at this ideal about family values, and we look at this the ideal of how society changes, that traditional family values actually disfavors alternative family values or alternative systems, and they only embrace a so-called Judeo-Christian structure. And so, in terms of looking at conservatives, the whole ideal of conservatism, when we closely examine it, it is a system that we can define it in terms of from it in a historical context. And when we look at it within a historical context, it becomes very clear why the overwhelming majority of Black people reject conservatism and see it as something negative and destructive, because conservative values and conservative beliefs have been destructive for the Black community. And they've continued to be destructive to the Black community. And so there's a reason why the vast majority of Black people reject conservatism. So let's take a look at, Black conservatism. Now, there is there was a statement made by the hip hop artist and rapper KRS-One, who was someone who was attempted to promote conscious rap, educational rap. And one of the things KRS-One said, he said, America has created a Black person who serves YT interest only. So he's making a definition. He's identifying a particular type of black person. And he says that America has created a Black person who serves YT interests only. And he's not saying that all Black people are like that. He's saying that there has been a group of people that have been created like that by America. And so when we begin to look further into what he's talking about, to say that this is that America has created a Black person that has these characteristics, we have to look at the ideal of the Black conservative, because the Black conservative actually is the person being identified by KRS-One. The Black conservative is the person who has embraced traditional values that put Black people into slavery, that put Black people in a system of Jim Crow segregation, that put Black people under a system of institutional racism, and that maintains Black people in a subjugated position in American society. And so this is what he's talking about when he talks about America has created a Black person who serves YT interests only. And that's what he's talking about. And so we look at in the popular movies today, in the popular mythology, in the popular belief system, there is a character that was created that resonated with Americans in the movie that was entitled Django Unchained, that involve Jamie Foxx playing the role of Django, and Samuel L. Jackson playing the role of Stephen. And it contrasted a radical Black person who was no nonsense for justice in playing the role of Jamie Foxx of Django, a person out for justice and right. And it contrasted him against what Samuel L. Jackson called the character as the most despicable Negro in the history of the world, this character, Stephen. And this character, Stephen, is the quintessential Black conservative. And if you look at him, he is, his role, his job, his entire purpose in life, in his own view, is to serve YT interest only. And so this is the reality that in terms of looking at when we begin to examine these individuals, right, in terms of the so-called black conservative. Now, I want to take a deeper dive into black conservatism. I want to look at conservative versus liberal ideology. And so most people would say that the Democrats are liberals, and they'll say that the Republicans are conservatives in general. Now, there may be some lines of variation because there may be some Democrats who lean toward conservatism in some areas, and there may be some Republicans who lean toward liberalism in some areas. So it's not an exact line, but it's a very close line, and it's a good analogy to be able to look at conservatism versus liberalism. And first of all, let's look at the Democrat liberal. The Democrat liberal argues for access to affordable health care and dental care. They want everyone to get health care, to have access to health care that they can afford. And there are some circles within, say, the Democratic Party and within liberals that go as far as to say that the government should pay for it completely, and that it should be, a universal health care, or it should be Medicare for all. There should be a system where everybody gets free health care. And then, of course, within the Democratic Party, there are those who say, well, it should just be affordable access so that everyone can afford it, and not necessarily that it's just free for everybody, but that it should be available for everyone and everyone should be able to access it. And that is part of the Democratic philosophy. In addition to that, if you contrast that, for example, on the Republican side, Republicans actually view healthcare as a privilege that is more that is the right of the more affluent, the more wealthy, and that people should have to pay for healthcare, and that those who can afford to pay for healthcare should have access to it, and the quality of their healthcare should not be diminished because it's available to everybody. That people who can pay for health care should not have to wait in a line or should not have to go through other things. That if everybody had health care, then you might have to sit in the lobby or waiting room of your doctor's office, and it'd be poor black people and homeless people and stuff like that in your doctor's office. And you wouldn't want to live like that. And so that's the philosophy of the Republican, the conservative. When we take a look at fair wages, people that are Democrats, that are liberal, they want fair wages. They want you to be able to get fair wages. If you work, you should be able to get a living wage. You shouldn't have to work all week and then you can't afford your housing costs. You can't afford food. You can't pay for prescription drugs if you need them. You can't afford to go to the doctor. You can't afford to take care of your children. You can't afford to do these things. You work and work and work, but you can't afford to do anything. So that you're, in essence, almost in a system of slavery because you're working without fair wages. You're not getting paid what you're worth in the overall society. And so liberals or Democrats, they want fair wages for everyone. On the other hand, Republicans, they want to keep minimum wage very low, because they value profits over the people. And they support the wealthy, the more affluent. And the more wealthy and affluent, they want to keep wages low so that they can keep profits high. And so this is what Republicans support. This is the Republican value to support this position. And we can go across the board and look at, for example, Democrats want everyone to have access to education. Some within the Democratic Party want everyone to have access to free education. But Democrats generally want people to have the access to education and that education is affordable. They support school loan, student loan forgiveness. They support all these kinds of things. Whereas on the other side, Republicans, they see education as something that's a commodity that money should be made off of it, and that it's a private luxury for those who can afford it. And so, therefore, they don't believe in student loan forgiveness. They don't believe that everyone should be able to get access to it because it creates competition. And they don't want that kind of competition to opposes them. Plus, most people, when they get educated, the more educated a person gets, the more likely they'll become liberal and a Democrat because they will reach a different level of intelligence and they won't work on just greed and profit motive. They will begin to see and humanize people in the human condition and situation. If we look at, for example, fair taxation, Democrats believe in fair taxation and Republicans believe in tax cuts for the wealthy. They want the wealthy to be preserved and protected. Why? Because the wealthy they support conservative politicians. They create a system that is imbalanced, that leaves the power concentrated in the hands mostly of conservative YT males. And so they don't support a fair tax burden. In addition, we can look at and see that Democrats and liberals support environmental and consumer protection. They want rules in place so that you can't go in and pollute poor people's neighborhoods, black people's neighborhoods, that you can't engage in predatory lending and predatory type activities against the poor because they don't have any real defense. So they believe that the government should defend these people and protect these people, and there should be regulations in place. On the other hand, Republicans or conservatives think no such protection should be in place. And so they support deregulation. They want businesses to be able to do whatever they want, no matter if it pollutes a black neighborhood or a poor neighborhood. They don't care. And, in terms of consumer protection, it's okay for them. They believe that it's okay. If businesses, if they loot the poor or, mistreat the poor, and, that's just life. And so there's a difference in the belief system and the philosophy. So if we take a look at the Democrats and liberals, well, they promote civil rights, that everyone has civil rights, that everyone has equal access to voting rights. They believe that everyone should have access to affordable child care. They believe in women's rights, that women should have rights and have fair wages, and that women should be treated equal in terms of if they produce and, they go to college and they get a college degree and all those kinds of things and they work, they should have access just the same as anybody else. In addition to that, they also believe and support human rights. They support affordable housing and reasonable gun control to keep communities safe. On the other hand, Republicans, they frown upon civil rights enforcement. They want to gut it, and they've worked diligently to gut civil rights enforcement. They've worked to limit voting rights so that they disenfranchise particular groups. And they have historically disenfranchised black people from being able to vote, so that black people don't have a voice. They don't have a say. They can be subjugated because they're not part of the political apparatus. And Republicans and conservatives have been moving in the direction recently to gut the Civil Rights Act, to gut the Voting Rights Act, to limit the enforcement of black civil rights, and to limit black voting rights enforcement, and to literally gut the Voting Rights Act so that they can eliminate black congressional districts and eliminate the black voice in the government. In addition to that, they're anti-women. They want to control women's bodies. They don't want women to be able to have a say and make decisions on their own on health issues. They are not supportive of human rights generally, of people, immigrants and others. They operate on a profit motive, and they reject gun control. So when we begin to look at the the values in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, it is no wonder that black people generally reject the Republican Party. And this is why the vast majority of black people reject conservatism and they reject the Republican Party. And because there is a difference in the values that exist in the black community and the values that exist in the conservative community. And so let me hone in now just for a second on the black conservative. And I think it's critical for us to take a look at the black conservative and put the black conservative in context. Okay, first of all, if we look at the demographics of America, if you were to just zoom out and take a bird's eye view of America itself, what you would see is you would see major concentrations of black populations. So you would see, for example, in New York, you'd see about 4 million black people, and mostly concentrated in specific areas. If you were to zoom out, you'd see about 2.3 million black people in the Atlanta metro area, 4 million in the New York metro area, and with major concentrations in specific areas. And with Atlanta, you'd see the same thing, but with 2.3 million black people. If you go to Washington, D.C. metro area, you'll see about 1.7 million black people in the metro Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. If you go to Chicago, you'll see about 1.3 million black people in the Chicago metropolitan area. If you go to Houston, you'll see about 1.5 million black people in the Houston standard metropolitan area. You could go to Dallas, Fort Worth and see another 1.5 million black people in the Dallas, Texas, Fort Worth standard metropolitan area. In Philadelphia, about 1.4 million black people in the Philadelphia metropolitan area. 1.3 million in the Miami metropolitan area, nearly 1 million people in the Detroit metro area, and nearly 1 million people in the Los Angeles metro area. And then if you begin to go and actually hone in and look at concentrations, you'll see in South Fulton, Georgia, about 93% of the population are black. In Jackson, Mississippi, about 80% of the population is black. In Detroit, Michigan, about 80% of the population is black. In Birmingham, Alabama, 70% of the population is black. When you look at Memphis, Tennessee, for example, you'll see about 63% black population. Montgomery, about 62% black. Baltimore, 60% black. Cleveland, 52% black. And we could go through and look at New Orleans and Newark, New Jersey, and Montgomery, Alabama, and Miami. We can look at all these areas and we see large concentrations of black populations. Black populations are not just scattered and integrated all over America. There is still major concentrations of black populations, large accumulations of black people. And when we begin to look at this and understand and recognize that these communities have distinctive and unique needs that are very different from many other communities. And the reason is because of the historical reality of these communities. Let's take a look at and understand these historical concentrations of black populations. If you go back and you begin to really examine what happened, if you go back to after the Civil War, you'll see that black communities were under attack. There was mob violence. There were racialized attacks against black communities. Whole black communities were burned and looted. Whole black communities and towns were flooded intentionally. There was massive lynching. If you look at the kinds of atrocities that were committed against black people, not only just in the South, but all across the country. Because look at like the what they call the Red Summer of 1919. You had black people attacked in communities in the North. All over the country, black people were attacked by YT mobs. Look at the Springfield riots in Springfield, Illinois in 1908. And so when we began to look at and understand the actual history of America, we can see that between 1910 and 1940, about 1 million black people fled from the South. And they fled in order to escape violence. They fled to escape the conditions that existed under Jim Crow segregation laws, where Jim Crow segregation laws were strictly enforced in the South. And also during that time, black populations concentrated in specific areas in the South, and they had to concentrate in order to try to protect themselves. But between 1940 and 1970, about 5 million black people migrated to northern, western cities. And so you had concentrations of black people who ended up in New York, who ended up in Philadelphia, who ended up in Chicago, who ended up in Detroit, who ended up in Los Angeles, who ended up in Oakland, who ended up in Gary, Indiana, who ended up in some of these major population areas where there are large numbers of black people concentrated today. And many of these people moved to these places because they were lured there because of factories and industries that were there, that were present there. As industrialization began to expand and these communities had factory work, black people fled there because it was an opportunity to work. And they moved, they migrated. There was massive migration. And think of 5 million people moving, and then think of the population growth that took place naturally as a result of just the natural growth in population. So we're talking massive millions and millions of people when you look at and compare to today's population of black people in the country. There's nearly 50 million people. When we begin to closely examine this, what we see is that these major concentrations of black people in these cities and these communities, they came there because they could work in a factory, they could, earn a living, they could take care of their families. But what happened is the concentration of ownership of these corporations, of these corporate entities, were by conservative YT men, were some of the main owners of most of these businesses and industries. And what happened is during this period of time, if we look back, there was the civil rights movement after Brown versus Board of Education declared that Jim Crow segregation was unconstitutional. And they said that it's no longer legal to segregate on the basis of race, that you can't ban black people from going to the public park. You can't ban black people from sitting anywhere they want on the bus. You can't ban black people from access to the mainstream of society. And so you had Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King do the Montgomery bus boycott. You then had sit-in demonstrations. You had all these things because some YT people refused to change their culture to accommodate the law, which the law said now segregation is unconstitutional. And segregation had developed through this whole Jim Crow era. And so now as this began to be dismantled, you had people like Martin Luther King come, and then you had someone like Jesse Jackson come along. And Jesse Jackson took it a step further. Instead of saying, we just want to have access to public accommodations, we just want to be able to, ride where we want on a train or sit where we want on the bus. We want to be able to go in any restaurant. We want to stay in any hotel. We want to be able to do all these things that everybody else does and have free access to society. Jesse Jackson took it a step further. He said that, look, we also want to have access to jobs and employment. We also, on a fair basis, We also want to be able to have access to, say, purchase a Burger King franchise or McDonald's franchise. We want to have access to the business community. We want Wall Street, who's collecting money and making money off of everybody, they should put a fair share of their deposits in Black-owned banks that can benefit Black communities, because the YT-owned banks are redlining Black neighborhoods and they're taking money out but not putting anything back in. So we challenge these. So Jesse Jackson came along and he challenged this whole structure and infrastructure. And what happened is it resulted in Blacks being able to get access to corporate franchises like Burger King, McDonald's, and others. It also resulted in Blacks getting access to becoming officers and directors in major corporations and having executive positions in various different roles where they were qualified. Not that they were just given something, but these are people who had merit and who were most often more qualified and had been excluded in the past because of their skin color. So we have this shift taking place in society, and we have this work that's being done in the civil rights movement. And what happens is when we actually look at what happened, rather than just let Black people have jobs and fair wages, they turn their sights to moving their factories and moving production and moving auto manufacturing and moving the manufacture of certain products and goods, moving it offshore. And so they shipped jobs to Mexico. The jobs that existed in these Black communities were shipped out to Mexico. They were shipped out to China. They were shipped out to India. They were shipped out to Indonesia. They were shipped out to the Philippines. They were shipped out to Pakistan. They were shipped out to other countries where they could pay less wages, cheaper wages. And the government gave them incentives and breaks and an ability to do this so that it made it financially feasible for them to do that. And what happened, it resulted in these communities becoming blue cities, becoming Democrat strongholds, Democrat cities. But these cities had lost their industrial base. So you had high Black male unemployment. You had massive poverty. You had conditions that caused the schools to begin to fail because they began to neglect the schools. Why? Because YT children fled to the suburbs and moved away from the inner cities. And they organized private schools, and they were able to get disproportionate government support and services that didn't exist in the Black community. And so the Black community found itself in a situation where they're once again back in a condition of poverty, in a condition of subjugation, in a condition where they're locked out of the system, where they lack access to capital, where they are placed in a position where now they have to live in rental housing that is more likely than not owned by a YT absentee landlord. They are put in a position where their resources are going out, the limited resources that they have are going out to enrich YT society. And they are in a condition of subjugation once again in the cities. So it creates gangs. It creates all types of situations of people trying to survive. And then also, Black people didn't have any boats. Black people didn't have the means to transport drugs and narcotics from foreign lands. And what happened is they began to flood Black communities with drugs and narcotics. And they then began to severely damage the Black community. And then under Ronald Reagan administration, his director of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, Alfred Rignery, he said that the typical criminal was a 14-year-old Black male from a single-parent family. And they created a stereotyping system. And so a whole system of police racial profiling. And then most people will blame the Democrats. They remember they'll look at the Clinton crime bill and they'll talk about Joe Biden because that's what's been promoted. But most people don't have the consciousness to go back and fully analyze and realize that there were 3 Reagan crime bills that created mandatory minimum sentences, that created the conditions that produced the massive swelling of the prison populations. And so they blamed the Clinton administration, which under the Clinton administration, they funded providing housing for overcrowding. They provided, a means to try to create some relief, when in reality, when we look back, the massive influx and increase had to do with minimum mandatory sentencing. It had to do with truth in sentencing. It had to do with Reagan policies. But most Black Americans, they've been fed the lie. They've been told the lie, and to put it all on Clinton and Biden and the Democrats, rather than look at the reality of the impact that the Ronald Reagan policies had. And so when we began to look at this and understand the history and see the impact of conservatism and see the demographic profile across the country of the population of where the people are, if you take a look at, and I want you to really, really think about this and put this in a context. I want you to take a look at, for example, let's take this fellow named Byron Donalds. Now, Byron Donalds was elected in the 19th Congressional District of Florida. Okay. Byron Donalds, 19th Congressional District. It's a district that's about 5.9% Black. 5.9% Black. And he always got under 10% of the Black vote. So Byron Donalds had virtually no Black support. In other words, his rhetoric, his talk, his speech, his representation, he didn't represent Black people. He represented YT people. He's not a voice of the Black community. He's not speaking for Black people. As a matter of fact, if he were to speak up on behalf of Black people in truth, they would shun him and reject him. He is a spokesperson for YT people, not Black people. He is what's called a Black conservative. Here's what KRS-One was talking about when he says that America has created a Black person who serves YT interest only. So Byron Donalds, when people say, oh, well, he's a Black guy and Donald Trump is not racist, he supports Byron Donalds. Well, Byron Donalds, he don't support Black people either. So when we take a look at it, the reality is that we could be hoodwinked because there's a Black face. Just because there's a Black face doesn't mean that person actually supports Black people, supports Black interests. That person could be the individual that KRS-One taught us about by saying that America has created a Black person who serves YT interest only. So Byron Donalds is one of those kind of people that serve the interests of YT people. He doesn't speak for Black people. He doesn't support Black causes or Black purposes. And we can go back and we can take a look again. For example, let's take a look at Burgess Owens, Congressman, 4th District, Utah. Now, Congressman Owens, there's about 1.2% Blacks in his district. 1.2%. In other words, there's very few Black people even in the district. And of that small amount of Black people in the district, 90% voted against him, right? So he's not someone who's a spokesperson for even the small Black community in Utah. Black people in Utah could see him for what he is. He is a Black person who serves YT interest only. So, he's another example of of a black conservative. We can look at Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina. And so Tim Scott, about 10% of the vote in South Carolina is black. About 10% of the vote. And we see that Tim Scott, right, in terms of, or in other words, there's a higher percentage of black population, but Tim Scott gets about 10% of the black vote. So that means about 90% of black voters voted against Tim Scott. So Tim Scott is not a voice for black people. Black people see him for what he is, and they didn't vote for him. So when we take a look at Tim Scott, he is what KRS-One says, America has created a black person who serves YT interest only. And so, we can go through and see there's a guy named John James in Michigan, and he got 0% of the black vote. In other words, like nobody black voted for this guy, right? Because his whole presentation and persona is just very clear what he is. He's like Stephen on Django. He is the quintessential despicable Negro who's anti-black. He's like more anti-black than the most extreme YT supremacists. And when we begin to really take a look at this and understand this history, we've got to understand this. The fact that you have, you can't find a major area where you have a black conservative who has any significant population of black people that he represents. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't exist anymore. There was a time when you had people like Edward Brooke and others who were Republicans, and they had black constituents. They had genuine black constituents, but they didn't hold on to this type of view that exists today. It was a different era of time, a different group of people, a different mentality. And so you can't go back and compare that time to now. Today, what you have is the black conservative is the quintessential despicable Negro that Samuel L. Jackson characterized by the character Stephen in the movie Django. And he is, in the black conservative is what KRS-One referred to as America has created a black person who serves YT interests only. That's just who they are. So let's take a deeper look into this. I want you to think for just a minute with me on this ideal, this thought. Now, think of America in America's history. So you have slavery, you have Jim Crow segregation, you have institutional racism, and you still have a continuing struggle over the issue of race all the way till today. Even though you have an administration that denies and claims that we're in a post-racial society, he's still taking action to disenfranchise black voters, to strip black people of employment, to damage the black community directly and openly. And so when we take a look at this and see where we're at and look at the whole history of the country, I want you to think about countries like Sweden and Denmark and the so-called Scandinavian companies and countries in Germany and Japan and all around the world. You see where countries that have developed wealth over time have now turned and looked at their people and said, okay, if you are a citizen of Canada, or if you're a citizen of Sweden, or you're a citizen of Denmark, then our country should be fair and equitable to you. You should be treated with dignity and respect, and we should honor the contribution that you and your ancestors have made to the wealth of the country. And so when we look at it in that context, I want you to think about this, is a social safety net welfare in a country where generations of your ancestors have created the national wealth, and and the wealthy have now the wealth has concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy people by operation of the legal structure has enabled and empowered this. So now you got a small group of wealthy people hoarding wealth, some of them having so much wealth that they could never spend it in their lifetime. They could never use it in their lifetime. They just have it and control it and manipulate it and withhold it from others. So it's a social safety net that made sure everyone had access to health care, that made sure that everyone had daycare and child care, that made sure that everyone had food to eat, and that everyone had a roof over their head, that everyone had access to education, that everyone had all of these things and they had a higher standard of living. That is this welfare. Would you call this welfare where multiple generations have produced the national wealth, and now by operation of law, by trick, by hook and crook, a small handful of people have concentrated this wealth and they have control over it, and they're holding it back and denying it to you, denying it to the people on the basis of saying, well, we're conservatives, and we're Republicans, and we believe in conservatism, and we don't believe in welfare and handouts and all these kinds of things, when everything that the wealthy got is a handout or robbery. It's taken from people. It's from multiple generations of struggle of people who have enabled and empowered and created the wealth that they now have hoarded and taken control of. And through government manipulation and control, it has enabled them to retain that wealth and build that wealth and secure that wealth and hide behind a legal wall. When we take a look at that, would it be welfare to be fair and equitable to the people? Or is that just a lie that Republicans and conservatives hide behind? Is it just disinformation? Is it just a misrepresentation of the facts? If we look in the United States today, there are about 989 billionaires. 989 billionaires. There's like 156 billionaires in England and 156 billionaires in Germany. And so when we take a look at the United States, we got 989 billionaires. We got 25.4 million millionaires. And we look at about 10% of the country have like 90% of the wealth. The vast majority of wealth is concentrated in the hands of a small group of people, the vast majority of this wealth. But they don't want to have a fair and living wage for poor people and people who are workers. They don't want you to have access to health care. They don't want you to have free education. They don't want you to have some of the basic things that produce high quality of life. They want you to suffer and have nothing so that they can be rich and wealthy, and they can float around on their yachts, and they can, travel and jet set around the world and do the things that they want to do. And, and every now and then they'll throw some money to some so-called causes in order to retain their structure so that they can maintain their wealth. And when we look at the system that exists, it is a system that is built on corruption. And we have to understand and recognize the nature of what it is. If we look at, why would we deem it welfare to have universal health care? Why would we deem it welfare if we wanted to eliminate homelessness? Why would we deem it welfare for having free college education or access or affordable access to college? Why would we deem it welfare for a living wage or to have a minimum guaranteed standard of living? Why would we consider any of these things welfare given a recognition of history. If we understand and recognize history, and someone is telling you that, well, it's a welfare state and they're trying to, it's about welfare, you could look at them and see that their very nature is either their very nature is corrupt and evil, and they have an evil eye and a malicious hand. It's either that or they are stupid, just plain outright stupid and ignorant. One or the other. Okay, and if we take a look at this and understand the reality of the situation, Dr. King once said, he said that in America, we have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. Many people, they didn't get what he was talking about. He said socialism for the rich. So the wealthy, when they get in trouble, they get corporate bailouts. They not only do they get corporate bailouts and they get subsidized, by taxation structure. In addition to that, all of the infrastructure and things that they have is supported by the government, and it supports their wealth and not poor people. And what happens is when you talk about doing affordable housing for poor people, or you talk about developing infrastructure that will benefit poor people, they can't do that. Why? Because they're reserving everything for the wealthy class. And so the reality is that I think there's a mentality that exists, and we have to look at it in business. And one of the things that for me, and I've got a couple of business degrees, and so I've studied this academically, formally, and I've been in the business world, and I've been active. And so when I talk about this, I'm talking about this from knowledge and direct experience and seeing this and observing this very much up close. That let's look at model one, business model one. So under business model one, you pay employees as less as possible because you are trying to maximize profits. So you pay less wages. It's less wages as you can because you want to make more and more profits. You want to provide any minimum benefit. So you only provide whatever benefits you're required to provide. So, you might, you'll pay into Social Security, you'll pay into Medicare tax, because it's a tax. But if you don't have to provide health care, you won't. Or if you do, you'll shift the financial burden onto the employee or reduce it so that you're considering the profit motive. And what happens is people, they're in a job, but they are not getting fair wages, livable wages. They are not getting benefits to be able to, take care of the health and the health of the family, dental care, or have any disability insurance that if they're not able to work, that they're covered. And then in addition to that, there's the system where they lobby the government to keep a low minimum wage so that minimum wage stays low so they don't have to pay that much. And so under this business model, it's about maximizing profits so that the wealthy can get more money. But in business model two also looks at the quality of life of the employee. And under this second business model, the employee is considered a partner in business. They're not considered as expendable. They're not considered as someone to be exploited. They're considered as a brother, as a friend, as a fellow citizen, as a fellow American. And under that system, you have quality of lifestyle. The employer looks at that. So they pay you a fair wage, a wage that enables them. They still make a profit, but they may not make as much of a profit, but they're still making a profit, a significant profit. But they're giving to their employees a lifestyle so that the employee can afford to pay their bills. They don't have to go and find a second job, and they can have some comfort in terms of they can spend some time with their children and their families, and they can do things together, and they can build a solid family life because they're not working all the time, because they're being strained, but in terms of because of low wages. They have benefits so that if they get sick, or the children get sick, or their spouses get sick, they can go to the doctor. They can get access to health care. They can go to the dentist. If you get sick, you can be covered by disability during your sickness. That you have some level of job security. You're not worried that they're just going to fire you and lay you off because of their profit motive. That you're in this together, that you're going to get fair wages, and that the government policy promotes fair wages. So, if inflation goes up and all these kinds of things happen, and what happens is the value of your dollar is reduced, then the minimum wages go up so that you have a fair wage and a living wage. And so there are two business models. One is a business model that is about extracting wealth from poor people and subjugating poor people. The other model is about community. It's about fairness. It's about harmony. It's about building the beloved community, about building a society that's fair and equitable. And it's not about hoarding wealth. And so these two business models in America, unfortunately, we promote the business model that is exploitive of poor people, that subjugates poor people, and that that claims that that nobody wants to work, and threatens and puts people in a position where and all safety nets are removed, and so that they can try to use that as an incentive to force you to labor. It's a system that is tantamount to a slave system. And when we look at this and understand capitalism, that capitalism, it can be a system of exploitation, or it can be a system where everyone works in harmony together, and that it is something that has fair and equitable distribution of wealth by control of the tax structure and system, by control of the minimum wage, by making requirements in terms of access to health care and all these things. So there are two diametrically opposed ways to do this. And when we take a look at it, the Democratic Party and liberals support a fair wage for everyone. They support a system that gives equitable resources to everyone, that gives access so that everyone can have a higher quality and standard of living. Whereas the conservative, the Republican, supports traditional values. And traditional values are slavery and exploitation, Jim Crow segregation, institutional racism, and exploiting the poor. And so when we began to look at this and understand the nature of what it is, and then we see that in the Black community, there's a small group of people that call themselves Black conservatives. And these Black conservatives actually promote the interest of that group of people who's out to exploit Black people, that's out to exploit the poor. They are not spokespersons for the Black community. They are not spokesperson for the poor. They are agents for the wealthy, and they are the people that that Samuel L. Jackson characterized as the most despicable Negro in terms of the character Stephen. They are also the character that KRS-One describes and talks about when he says that America has created a Black person who serves YT interest only. That's the Black conservative. That's what makes a Black conservative. Now, let's take a look at, for example, Clarence Thomas on the United States Supreme Court. So Clarence Thomas is apparently has Black skin color. But when we look at the policies of Clarence Thomas. First of all, he got where he got because of what? Affirmative action. He got in the door because of affirmative action. Because remember, there was a time when even if you had merit, you couldn't get in the door. So it had nothing to do with merit, because racism prevailed over all. So Clarence Thomas could not get in so that he could get to the position to the Supreme Court. But because of the march, the demonstration, and the changing in laws from the struggle of black people, Clarence Thomas gets in. He benefits from affirmative action. He benefits from the policies of Democrats and the policies that black people promoted. And then you look at Clarence Thomas gets in, and the first thing he does is he wants to shut down affirmative action. He wants to damage civil rights. He wants to restrict voting rights. He wants to do all of the things that would be destructive and damaging to black people. He is a black conservative. His mind has been warped and corrupted. And somebody put in the post that he has a YT wife. Well, so does Byron Donalds, has a YT wife. Tim Scott, I believe, had one. John James has one. And when you look at them, most of them, they are people who are isolated from the black community. They don't, they don't embrace the black community at all. They don't embrace their blackness. They attempt to shun and hide their blackness, even though they can. And so when we take a look at and understand this this dynamic, we see that these individuals like Clarence Thomas, he's like, when we say that he's a despicable Negro, and we say that that America has created a black person who serves YT interests only, then we're talking about somebody like Clarence Thomas, who identifies himself as a black conservative. Because his interest is not in the black community. He doesn't look at the black community and see that, hey, look at that population of black people in Chicago, in New York, in Atlanta, in Houston, in Philadelphia. He doesn't look at these major pockets of black people. And so what he does is he'll help them, the YT supremacists, he'll help them work to eliminate black congressional districts, so that these large population areas of black people can't even get a black representative to have their voice in Congress, so that black people's voice is silenced in the federal government, so that black rights at the state level are curtailed. So this is someone who will help enable and empower. He is an instrument of YT supremacy. He is he's a black person who's created to serve the interests of YT only. He's not there to serve black people. He doesn't even identify with black people. He hates black people. And I think when we look at it and understand it, his actions indicate that he hates black people. If you want to try to say, okay, well, that's a value judgment. How do you know what he does? You can look at what he does, and that tells you what he thinks, because he wouldn't do the things that he does if he loved black people, if he cared about black people, if he wanted to see black progress. He wouldn't do the things he does. He wouldn't say the things he says. He wouldn't take the positions that he takes. And we can see the same thing across the board with all of these people who claim to be black conservatives. And so when we take a look at the reality of the situation, the black conservative doesn't recognize the overall black community. They reject the conditions that exist. They reject the situation, and what they do is they have an unrealistic view of the black community in the black world. And they're mostly people who they're afraid to walk down the street in the black community. Why? Because their belief system is such. They've been trained and their thinking is such. They're afraid of the black community. They hate the black community. Why? Because they've been forged into an instrument that is anti-black. And that's what we're up against and what we're dealing with. So when people talk about black conservatism, and they, people say that they're black conservative. I think we have to begin to closely examine and understand the nature of what that actually means. Because when a person says they're conservative and they believe in traditional values, and what are traditional values? Traditional values is being anti-black. Traditional values was slavery, Jim Crow segregation, institutional racism. That is traditional values in America. And so in terms of looking at this situation overall, it becomes, I think, very critical to do a close examination of what is happening and understand where we are now. And I want to point to a couple of things I think that are critical for us to take a look at and to examine. Let's take a look at voting rights, for example. If we look at voting rights, we can go back and we can see that between right after the American Civil War, there was about 2,000 black elected officials. There were black members of Congress and all that. And what happened is they were quickly dismantled because after the so-called Great Compromise of 1877, Reconstruction was ended, and white supremacists actually just attacked and disenfranchised black people and suppressed the black vote, came up with poll taxes. They gerrymandered election districts. They used literacy tests. They used all kinds of methods to disenfranchise black people. And by 1901, there were 0 blacks in the United States Congress. And for a whole generation to 1929, there were no blacks in Congress at all. And then between 1929 and 1960, there were a total of 5 blacks. There were no more than 5 by 1960. And then after the Voting Rights Act prohibited discrimination in voting, it prohibited using terror tactics and all kinds of methods to suppress the black vote. After the law was put in place and enforced, what happened is you saw a rapid increase in black elected representation. To today, there's 66 black members of Congress versus 5 in 1960, or 4 in 1960. When we began to actually look at the demographics and look at what happened and see the impact that the Voting Rights Act had, we then see a proliferation of black representation. Still not equal to what it should be based on the demographics and numbers, but moving in that direction. And we see progress being made. But then we see the conservatives come in and begin to work to dismantle voting rights, the structure of voting rights, to eliminate voting rights enforcement. And then, of course, they gained enough power to get Donald Trump in office, get control of Congress and the Supreme Court. And what has happened now is they've gutted the Voting Rights Act completely. They have discontinued the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act. And what we see happening now is black people slipping backwards. And some of the people who are involved in facilitating this step backwards is the black conservative, because he is the agent that white supremacists can say, oh, we're not racist. See, we support Byron Donalds. Now, no black people supports Byron Donalds. Byron Donalds is not a spokesperson for the black community. He ain't saying nothing in support of the black community in reality. And neither are the other black conservatives. They are parroting disinformation to attack the black community, to attack the Democratic Party, just waging constant attacks against them and criticizing. They're not saying anything constructive. They're not promoting any type of valid or viable solution. They are on the other side. They are the instrument of the destruction of the black community. They, in fact, are the instruments that the Karras one is talking about. When we take a look at this history and go back, what we see is that in World War II, about 1.2 million black people fought in World War II on behalf of the Allied forces. Black Americans, 1.2 million. And about 1.2 million Africans from the African continent fought on behalf of the Allied forces. In 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, they had a meeting. They got together and they met on a ship. And they examined and looked at, the global situation, and they decided that, look, after World War II is over with, things have to change. So we can't be territorial, and we're going to try to scoop up and advance and take control of more and more territory and be greedy and try to hoard more wealth. We can't do that. The world is not going to let that continue to happen. We need to change things. And so they came to an agreement that was called the Atlantic Charter. And this Atlantic Charter actually was the foundation of the United Nations. And it became a system that was designed to create an organizational structure for the world. Because black people in Africa, by that time, they couldn't be contained any longer. There were African liberation movements proliferating. And it was obvious that these black people who fought in World War II and World War I, you couldn't just keep doing what you're doing to them. And so what they did, there was African liberation movements. And they saw this, and they realized that as these things unfold, we need to have a system in place so that we can all be seated at the table and talk and have a means to work out problems so that the world doesn't plummet and descend into a World War III, into chaos. And that's why they had this meeting where it was called the Atlantic Charter. And so ultimately, there came later a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that set a global standard, an international standard for the very first time about how people should be treated and what rights people have, saying that you can't just enslave people and exploit people and do all these bad things to people that countries and individuals did openly in the past. And so when we look at all of these things that unfolded, and we see that that there was pressure, international pressure, to give black Americans civil rights, to give black Americans voting rights, to give black Americans access to the system so that they could participate on equal terms. And there was massive resistance to this because there were people who wanted to maintain the culture of white supremacy. But when we take a look at what actually happened and understand the history and see the struggles that took place, black conservatives don't have a clue about any of this history. When you start talking to them, they don't have a black consciousness to really understand what happened. Most have been just the beneficiary and recipient of the civil rights movement, but they don't know what really happened or understand what really happened. Neither do groups that, like the people calling themselves FBA and ADOS. They don't really have an understanding of what actually happened. They don't understand the nature of the rights that they have today and where these rights come from, how these rights were secured. And so we're in a situation where we have an obligation today to talk about these issues and to expose the black conservative for what it is, to be able to recognize, as KRS One said, America has created a black person who serves YT interests only. And that person is the black conservative. And I'll close out with one more example. There's a Thomas Sowell. Now, Thomas Sowell is considered an academic scholar. He is part of what they call the Hoover Institute of Stanford University, which is a conservative think tank. And so he is a black voice for YT America, but he doesn't represent black people. He's not in the black community. He's tangentially connected only to black conservatives. Most black people look and frown upon him as the enemy of black people because his positions undermine the progress of black people. He is a voice that helps YT people justify the oppression of black people, to help justify the suppression of black people. And so you have people like this He got to where he was through affirmative action. He got to where he was through the struggle of other black people. And then, he becomes what he's become. And so this quintessential, what Samuel L. Jackson called, in terms of the character Stephen, that he was the quintessential, most despicable Negro in the history of the world, is how he characterized them. And when we look at that and then see KRS-One saying that America has created a black person who serves YT interest only, that's the black conservative. That's the message that we should understand. We should take a look at this and recognize the fact that that is, in fact, what we're dealing with. That is, in fact, part of the group that has Black America under attack. And